In this video, we will be changing the catalytic converter on my 2011 Chevrolet Cruze. So the first step is always we're going to jack up the car and put it on jack stand. So for the Chevrolet Cruze, the catalytic converter is actually attached to the exhaust manifold, so they come as a single unit. Now we're going to go under the car and start taking off the 3 bolts that the converter attaches to the flex pipe. So we're going to start by heating it up and then attach a socket to it and try to take off what's left of the nut. It doesn't really look like a nut anymore. So the nuts that we're going to be taking off are 12mm. The first one I'm taking off is actually L11 since they tend to get smaller as more rust builds up. So the second nut and bolt snapped off, but it's fine since the new converter comes with a new nut and bolt. Now we're going to separate the flex pipe from the catalytic converter and remove the old gasket. Now we're going to go on top and use a oxygen sensor socket to take off the oxygen sensor and unplug it from the harness. Now we're going to remove the bracket that holds the wires for the oxygen sensor and the other bracket here on the left to make space for the heat shield to come out. Now the bolt holding on the bracket for the oil dipstick wasn't there for my car, as well as the 2 bolts on the bottom for the heat shield. They're not holding onto anything since they just rusted out. So now that the heat shield is free, it can come out now. You're going to have to twist the oil dipstick out of the way to make enough space for it to come out. So here I'm just trying to salvage the 2 bolts that were holding the bracket from the bottom, but only one came out. Now we're going to shoot some PB blaster on all the 8 bolts that we're going to be taking out for the exhaust manifold. So the nut holding on the exhaust manifold is a 10mm. And as you're taking them out, either the nut comes out alone or it comes out with the stud. If only the nut comes out, you're going to have to use a E7 socket to take out the stud. Now we're going to go ahead and take out the ones on the bottom. So same thing with the ones on the bottom. I'm using a 10mm socket with a short extension. Now we're going to go back under the car, and there's 2 more bolts holding on the catalytic converter. The size for the bolts are E14 sockets, and there's 2 of them on either side. Now we can remove the old gasket, and we're going to try to pull out the exhaust manifold and the catalytic converter through the top. Since it's really tight, I did this off camera, so you're going to have to remove the oil filter and the housing. The oil filter on the Chevrolet Cruze use a 24mm socket, so once you remove that, it just gave me enough space to take it out. Just be careful, because there's the cooling fan and the AC hoses in the way, and you don't want to damage those. Okay, so now that the converter and the exhaust manifold is out of the way, we're going to use some paper towels to block off the exhaust ports. And then we're going to use some sanding paper and some brake cleaner to get the surface nice and clean so we can put on the new gasket. So now that the surface is clean, we're going to go ahead and put the new catalytic converter and the exhaust manifold on. So put on your new gasket, and we're only going to get a few bolts started up. And on the bottom we're going to put the gasket for the converter to the flex pipe and then tighten those bolts down. So the bolts that came with the aftermarket part are actually 13mm instead of 12 like the older ones. So now I went ahead and put the two bolts that were holding on the catalytic converter from the middle onto the bracket. The new bolts didn't line up as well, so I had to use the old bolts. Now we're going to go back on top and tighten down the exhaust manifold bolts. So you want to tighten them down in a cross pattern, working your way from the outside towards the middle. Okay, so we're almost done. Now we're just going to put back the oil filter. And then we're going to put the heat shield back on. Now we're going to put the bracket for the oxygen sensor wires back on, as well as the bracket that was on the left side of the heat shield. And finally, we're going to connect the oxygen sensor back on and put back the connector. So just to recap, to make sure you didn't forget anything. So twist the oil dipstick back into place, and with the bolts that I salvaged from earlier, I was able to tighten down the bracket since I couldn't use them anymore for the bottom of the heat shield since they just rusted out. And then make sure your oxygen sensor is back on and tight. And lastly, don't forget to tighten back down the oil filter housing.